to those here and far away in northern Vermont. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Bill Mayers from Burlington, and I'm the author of Making Beer, as well as several other books. And I'm here to talk to you about making beer, not so much how to it, but how my life has been intertwined with the brewing revolution of the last 50 years. And I'll start with a poem by A.E. Housman. He wrote, "O many a peer of England brews, livelier liquor than the Muse, and malt does more than Milton can to justify God's ways to man. Ale, man, ale's the stuff to drink for fellows whom it hurts to think." Now, in 1975, there were 50 brewing companies in the United States, and none in Vermont. In 2022, there are over 9,000 breweries in the United States and 66 in Vermont, making Vermont the state with the highest number of breweries per capita. So what happened and how? I've been lucky to participate in a small way in this two-front revolution. I began making homebrew in the 1970s when my wife and I moved to St. Johnsbury, and we were doing various kinds of back-to-the-land activities, such as raising sheep and chickens and beekeeping and pottery. But before that, I had to learn to drink. So this is, if you look up in the upper left-hand corner, the person with the outstretched hands is myself in Japan on a college singing tour, where we did learn to drink like gentlemen. So it's a trait and a craft and an experience that never left me. Well, in those early 70s, beer making, homebrew, was very primitive. It was still illegal. Since Prohibition had no brewing and drinking at all, but even after Prohibition, home brewing was illegal. People did it, but they did it in primitive ways, such as buying cans of Blue Ribbon hopped malt and using Fleischmann's bread yeast instead of regular beer yeast. And it was really pretty dreadful stuff, but that's what you had. And so things like my first batch, we thought, well, we'd done the recipe correctly, but then when we put it in the basement, the bottles began to pop, break, crash, bang. And so to get them out of the basement, I got myself in protection and took them outside and let them blow up safely. Well, the landscape changed. In 1977, President Carter signed a bill making homebrew legal, making it legal. And you were allowed to make up to 200 gallons of brew safely and legally. Well, I never made 200 gallons, but I did make 10, 15, 20 gallons at a time. And gradually, it got so even when we would serve beer, my wife and I, to friends, they would actually drink it. They wouldn't pour it into the ferns or make several trips to the bathroom with their glass of beer. And it became something that was really, I was proud of it. And in 1970, my publisher, I published several other books, the publisher in New York said, "There's this brewing revolution going on in the country. Why don't you go out and do a book about it?" I thought, well, that'd be pretty cool. So I went on the road. I went first to places in Vermont. There were no breweries in Vermont. Then I went down to some breweries in Massachusetts. And I also found places where some companies were starting to import home brewing supplies from England. There wasn't much in the United States, but these were home brewing shops. First one that I went to was Northampton, Mass. And gradually that industry grew so that there was then a home brewing shop in downtown Burlington, and then one in Winooski. The one in Winooski still exists. And gradually there was more and more home brewing, and then a small number of little breweries began to arise in Colorado, Oregon, California. And this is actually this is the home brewing shop in Winooski now, the Vermont Homebrewers. And it's much more elaborate than they were in those early days. Lots more equipment here, and they also sell winemaking equipment. And these are replicated across the country. So if you're a home brewer, you don't want to buy your own, you can do it now in much better, with much better equipment than you could 40 years ago. And this is just a picture of me in the old days, getting hops from a neighbor who had this wonderful hops plant, and these were good ingredients for my home brewing. So this is, I don't know how well you can see this, but it basically is the brewing process. In Germany, there still is what's called the Reinheitsgebot, which means you can only make beer from 4 ingredients: water, hops, malt, and yeast. And I like to say that the good brewer is a good either a marriage counselor or a priest who oversees the marriage of the sweet malt with the bitter hops to get this wonderful beer. And the process begins with the grinding of the malt, of malted barley. Then it is, in effect, soaked at 160 degrees. The fermentable sugars are extracted from it. They are filtered out, added to a kettle that's brought to a boil, and the hops are added, and for about an hour, and then that is cooled down, filtered. The yeast is added, and the yeast will stay for 2 to 3 weeks if it's an ale, maybe a month or more if it's a lager. Then it's filtered one more time, and then either put in kegs or bottles, and goes out for your delight and the bar's delight. Well, this is just a flavor wheel, which there's some in many different foods, and if you could look at it closely, you can use a lot of these fancy adjectives to say what your beer tastes like. So I went on the road first. Well, I went to California, and there met a guy named Jack Mcauliffe. Jack Mcauliffe had been a naval seaman who had been in the U.S. Navy and been stationed in Scotland for 4 or 5 years, and began to drink English beers. And he liked them enough, so when he returned to the U.S. and left the service, he started what became the first microbrewery in the United States in really probably you can say the 20th century, in the late or 1977, 78. And he called it New Albion after the name of the ship of Sir Francis Drake, because Sir Francis Drake had sailed into San Francisco Harbor, so he liked this image. And then he was followed. Unfortunately, he ran out of money, and after about 4 or 5 years, he had to shut down his little brewery. But it inspired people up and down the West Coast and in Colorado primarily, and then, of course, after in the rest of the country. And so he's the real pioneer, and he gave me this empty bottle, which then I gave to the Smithsonian Institution. So if you go to the Smithsonian in Washington and you look at the beer exhibit, you'll see this bottle. This is a lineup of some of the real greats in that early brewing period. So in the wheelchair is Mcauliffe. This is taken 2 years ago. And on his right is Professor Michael Lewis, who taught brewing science at UC Davis. And then next to him is Charlie Papazian, who founded the American Homebrewers Association and is really the great guru of homebrewing in this country. And the next him is Teresa Mcauliffe, who's the curator of beer. And behind her is Fritz Maytag of Anchor Steam Beer. And then Ken Grossman, one of the founders of Sierra Nevada. And then the other guy is me. Now, I weaseled my way into this because this was for the opening of this beer exhibit down there. And Charlie Papazian is famous. I don't know if any of you are homebrewers, but he coined this wonderful phrase, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. After the Homebrewers Association was founded, then there was a Brewers Association founded for professional brewers. And their phrase is a little more, pretentious. And they say, craft beer drinkers are explorers with non-linear taste preferences. Now, you can do with that what you want. As more and more homebrewers got better and better, they started to think, I'd like to be a professional brewer. I'd like people to buy my beer. And they had there were two threads that they could choose early on. They could do a freestanding brewery where they would then produce beers that would be sold retail, sold to convenience stores, sold to grocery stores, or they could hitch their beer to a restaurant and make what we call a brew pub today. And brew pubs had really come from Britain. There was a string of brew pubs in England called the Fox and Firkin and the Pheasant and Firkin, and they were very popular. And so people began to, the people who started these breweries they had these choices, and they each had drawbacks, because if you're going to do just beer, you had to sell against every other beer that was in the market. But if you were in a restaurant, you could say, well, I'm the first one to have beer with the food, but you still then had two ways in which you had to please the customer, both with your food and with the beer. So I don't know what the ratio is now, but I would think maybe there's 3 to 1, three breweries to every one brew pub, something like that. I don't think it's 50-50, but I haven't looked at that number recently. Now, another one of these early pioneers in brewing was a guy who was a photographer originally. He took wonderful photographs of suburbs in California, named Bill Owens, and he wrote this little book on how you could build a brewery in 10 days, and he did so, and he sold a little beer, but he was more of a energized Renaissance man with his photography, and he's now in the distilling business, but he was famous for his one great beer was called Alimony Ale, the bitterest brew you'll ever drink. So this was the cover of the first book. This came out in '84. And at that time, there were 10, 11 small breweries, new breweries in the country, besides, the big guys, Budweiser and Schlitz and so forth. And the subtitle of the book, I don't know if you can read it, is all these one how to make beer. So the publisher wanted me to have some recipes. They wanted to talk about ingredients. And also, I could put in this last chapter, which was how to avoid the temptation to start your own brewery. So the chapter was called Home to Homebrew, because after I did the numbers and found that whichever of these options I took, it's going to be $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, and I didn't really want to be a brewer for the rest of my life. So I went on to other things. I went in the legislature and taught school and wrote some more books. But 10 years later, the publisher says, how many breweries are out there now? And by that time, there were 600 breweries in the country. Lots of people who, even if they'd read the book, didn't take my advice. I mean, that's fine. So this was the second edition of the book. And that one allowed me to talk about the beginnings of Vermont brewing. And when I was in the legislature, the guy there, Greg Noonan, approached me. He was from Massachusetts, and he'd written a very well-received book on brewing lager beers. And he had dreamt about doing a brew pub, and he didn't want to do one in Massachusetts. He didn't like to be in Massachusetts. He liked Vermont. So he came up here and started looking around for someone who could help him pass a law, because you couldn't do brew pubs in Vermont at that time. You couldn't have a manufacturer couldn't have a retail license. And this goes back to the laws from Prohibition, where they deliberately set up what's called the three-tier system between manufacturer, distributor, and retailer of beers. And this was to keep manufacturers from controlling the retail market, as is done in New York, in Great Britain, where the great breweries have hundreds or thousands of outlets. And so he heard that I was a home brewer and I was in the legislature, and so for over a 2-year period, we worked on drafting a bill, getting it supported, passed, finally. So in November of 1988, he opened the Vermont Pub and Brewery in Burlington, and I got to cut the ribbon. So that's my one great piece of legislation in all my years in the legislature. But at any brewer's meeting, I get introduced as the guy that brought brew pubs to Vermont, so why not? Okay, so this is what a brew pub looks like today, or at least one. I mean, there are lots of them in Burlington, in Vermont, but this is down on the waterfront. If you can drink legally, I recommend it. Great place. But it really, you see, they got the tanks are all right there, cheek by jowl, next to the people in the brewery and in the bar, and then they have a restaurant attached. But brew pubs have become an established entity in the United States. So these are some of the breweries in Vermont. The first real standalone brewery in Vermont was started in White River Junction by a guy named Steve Mason, Catamount, and they were successful, but then they got kind of overextended, and eventually got bought out by Harpoon. So there's still Catamount beers, and they're made in, I think they're made in Windsor at Harpoon's location. But Steve Mason is the first real brewer or commercial brewer in Vermont. Ray Mcneal, another one early guy. His brewery and his beers are as crazy as he looks. I mean, he'd started his adult life as a cellist, and I think played professionally, but then got into beer and made some really wonderful beers down there in Brattleboro. But again, he was undercapitalized, and he just couldn't ratchet up his operation. So he's one of the first, but not the most successful. Then Otter Creek was started in Middlebury by a Reed College graduate named Lawrence Miller, which did quite well until he decided, well, he'd had 12 or 15 years of brewing, and he went on to other things and sold the brewery to I think the Long Trail, which was Long Trail was founded in Bridgewater, still exists down there, by a guy named Andy Fearson. What have I got? 2 of these? Well, anyway, that's Otter Creek. Alan Newman is kind of a serial entrepreneur. He was a founder of Gardner Supply, a founder of Seventh Generation Goods, a founder of Magic Hat, and Todd Hare came up from New Jersey in late 90s to first work in the brew house and then to become head brewer. And when he came, they were making something like 8,000 barrels of beer. When he left them, they were making 180,000 barrels of beer, and they were really a sizable regional operation, which then got bought out by a company, I think Utica Club in New York, and now is owned by another another brewing company. Well, one of the starting, 25 years ago, there were enough brewers in the state to want to have an association. And one of the ways that the association makes money, one of its primary ways, is to have brew festivals. And the big one is on Burlington's waterfront, which they've done for 25 years, and another one, smaller one at Killington, which has also been about 20 years. I just went down to the Killington one this weekend. Pretty muddy. But they are very popular because 20, 30, sometimes more breweries will bring their beer, and you buy a set of tickets, drink tickets, and this is the opening of the afternoon session at the Burlington waterfront, where people line up and then they run for their favorite brewery to get in line, because unfortunately a lot of the time you spend at these brew fests is standing in line, particularly if you're standing in line for popular beers. These are just a couple pictures of some of what I would say are the giants in Vermont brewing today. So the guy on the left, Sean Hill, is the founder of Hill Farmstead in Greensboro, world famous, you would say. And on the right is Todd Hare, now of Foam. This is also, again, Sean Hill on the right, and Bob Montgomery, one of his I think his, not, sort of second in command. Okay, John Kimmich and Jen Kimmich, they founded Alchemist first in Waterbury and now in Stowe. Really world-class brewers and with a world-famous beer, Heady Topper and then Fokelbanger and Sean Lawson and his wife Karen. They're in Waitsfield. He did something that I don't know if anybody else has done. He ran out of space. He had his little brewery at his house in Waitsfield, and then he couldn't find space to build a brewery in Vermont, so he contracted out to a brewery in Connecticut and brewed his beer there until he was able to come back to Waitsfield and build a brewery there, in a bigger brewery in down off of 100 in Waitsfield. And Steve Parks, English, who owner of Drop-In Brewery in Middlebury, and he has one of the great lines of keeping beer fresh, and he said, in England they say beer should not travel farther than a wagon, horse-drawn wagon, can travel in 2 days. So what did that mean in England? It meant sort of 20 miles. You shouldn't be putting beer into kegs and bottles and sending it all the way across country or across the oceans. He's one of the 2 winners of the Russell Shearer Award, which is the quality or the award within the brewing industry, the craft brewing industry, for the greatest contribution in that particular year, because he set up a school called the American Brewers Guild, and he moved it from California to Middlebury, and then as an adjunct to that, he set up his own brewery, Drop-In Brewery. Paul Hale, a PhD chemist at UVM. About 10 years ago, he and 3 friends decided, well, we want to have a brewery, because they were excellent home brewers. And so they set up this brewery on Pine Street in Burlington, Queen City. And this is, I guess, part of his beer can collection. And this is what the bar looks like, and the old truck also belongs to Paul. And they've taken the attitude that they want to make a smaller number of beers of really classic types, mainly from Europe, Scotland, England, Belgium, Germany, and that's what they serve. So they're drawing on a clientele that comes in really more for these specific beers rather than turnover, which is our variety, because some places like, let's see if I can go back. Foam has, in 5 years, Foam has produced something like 600 different beers. And their business model, if you will, is to make small batches that even if they sell out great, if they sell out very quickly, they can make them again, because most of these are 2 or 3 week old beers. Or if it doesn't sell well, they're not committed. They haven't invested in a beer which they can't sell and which has a shelf life. So it's both are successful in their own ways. It's one of those decisions I don't have to make because I'm not a brewer. Okay. Oops. Sorry. So Todd Hare, I showed you a picture of him. He and I got to know each other because we're both beekeepers, and we ended up keeping some beehives behind Magic Hat when they were in South Burlington 10 years ago or 12 years ago. Then he left Magic Hat and went to Switchback, and but we kept in touch. And so at one point we were drinking modestly, and I don't know, maybe it was his idea, maybe it was my idea, but we said, well, what about us doing a little sour beer operation? Sour beers are really quite a different kind of beer. They're made with a really very bitter, more bitter hop. I mean, it's almost a sour tasting hops. It's what Belgian beers are, and it's complex. It's not what your first taste is. What we like to say, what we came to say, is there are 3 sips to enlightenment with drinking our beer. The first sip is, Jesus Christ, this stuff's so awful. I can't stand it. And the second sip is, that's kind of interesting. And the third sip is, where can I buy it? So it is an acquired taste. But the neat thing about making beer on this scale is there's no huge investment. You can buy the wort from another brewery, and you just need tanks to age it. So we went on a trip out to the west, to Oregon, and we went to 22 breweries in about 12 days, and became ever more interested in this notion of a sour beer operation. And this happens to be, Deschutes is a big operation, like 250,000 barrels, and this is their bar inside the brewery with all these different beer pools. And the most interesting brewery was this one in Bend, Oregon, which was just in a little, almost like a goat shed. This guy, Paul Arney, is a third generation, or both his father and grandfather had been pharmacists, apothecaries. So he called this Ale Apothecary, and he was making sour beers like this in very small batches, maybe 100 barrels a year, something like that. But really wonderful tasting beers. So Todd and I said, all right, we can do this. Though, without going into all the details, we found a spot on Pine Street in Burlington, a noised hire, rented a bay. We brought in a number of barrels. There were new and old oak barrels, some from Hungary, from France, from Pennsylvania, and loaded them up and bought wort from Zero Gravity Brewery across the street, put our yeast in it, kept the beer for 1.5, 2 years in these barrels, and then bottled it, and started selling them. And this became the 3rd edition of my book, which I did with him because it tells about how finally, after 40 years, I finally got to be a brewer, but it was all Todd's. I mean, Todd's the brewer, I'm just the pretty face. And so now, well, last year, we ended up selling the House of Fermentology back to foam. So they now, if you go into foam, you can usually get it. We don't do very big batches, but all of them are good. And all of our beers have dot in the name. So they start off with just color dots, purple dot and crushed dot and red dot and so forth. And now it's a fancier name, but they all have dot. And it's Todd's principle of great art always begins with a single dot. So that was our promise to people. So this was my license plate until I gave it to Todd. This is a batch of our bottles early on. And this just shows the number of the economics of Vermont's breweries, with 66 and overall value to the state, $325 million, and almost 3,000 employees. I'm sure that's, well, I think that's about right now. And then here's a book that you should look up sometime. It's just a great collection. It's a little out of date, but it's got little one-page stories about breweries in Vermont. So some of the ones, these are the two authors, Kurt Stouter and Adam Krokowski. These are, well, the book has good, so in this one, what has I got? Oh, Zero Gravity. Yeah, that happens to be one of my sons doing work. You know, if you imagine all the cans, if they're doing, I don't know, 30,000 barrels of beer, and a lot of them are going into cans, think of how many millions of cans there are. And then I just put these in just because there are 4 different kinds of beer, 4 different breweries making beers with honey, which Todd and I put some honey into our beers, but other breweries are doing it, and this is just a way of kind of me celebrating 2 hobbies, beer making and beekeeping. So we got the Shed, we got Burlington Beer, we got Kramer and Kin up in the islands, and we got our what do I call this one? Something dot. Psychological dot, I think. And so I'll take questions from anybody. Yeah, you have to go to foam. We just don't make enough to sell out into the trade, but yeah. Well, I think you have to think about styles. So I guess my favorite Pilsner would be Pilsner Urquell from the Czech Republic, and my favorite stout would be Guinness, and my favorite sour beer would be House of Fermentology Crush Dot. It's an embarrassment of riches for the beer drinker today. I mean, there's just so much wonderful beer. I mean, there's a lot of poor beer, but you know, it makes, in a little kind of a small way, it's kind of fun to say you're a part of this revolution. Because I used to have the first 10 years or so after I did the first book, I would get calls from people around the country saying, how do I start my own brewery? And I would have to keep saying, well, didn't you see the last chapter? It says home to homebrew. It says, I'm not smart enough or good enough to do that. But God willing, you guys will do it. And I think the proof is in the numbers of breweries that are out, that have been set up. And it's very exciting. And so I don't know. I don't say. Maybe 40 years ago I would have said I had a favorite beer, but now I don't think you could say it, but you don't have. I don't have access to the same beer all the time. I mean, I wouldn't want to just say I'm going to go and buy nothing but foam, one of their beers, or even, I love Alchemist. I love Heady Topper, but I'm not going to drink that for the rest of my life. Do you have a favorite style of beer? Sorry? Do you have a favorite style of beer? Favorite what? Style of beer. Oh. Well, again, I guess I'd plead. No. When I made beer, my favorite beer was I made a porter. It was one good beer that I could make. I could never make a good lager. It's too hard and it's too demanding, and you have to really keep them refrigerated and lagered, which is the German word for storing at temperature. I think I made, out of 100 or so batches, I think I made one good lager. But the porter was pretty good, and when I started making it, there were more and more varieties of hops that were coming in or available, so you could play around a little bit more. But I like a good IPA, double IPA. You know, I've passed the age when all I want to do is just get drunk. I mean, the way we all did as raw youth. Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly. I mean that's I mean that's in fact even when I started you would have you'd have the way they distinguish would be boiled hops is where you really get the bitterness, and then the flavoring hops would be thrown in either at the very end of the boil or after you turned the heat off, and those were called flavoring hops, and they were more delicate, and yeah, and it still is a practice, and people now are using what they call wet hops, where they'll actually soak the hops and then add them to the boil, and so it's, yeah, I think you have to do that if you're really going to get the really wonderful floral quality and be able to distinguish between hops, because if you just throw any kind of the most delicate hops into the boil, it'll be just like throwing in the ones with the highest alpha acid rate, and it'll be bitter, but it won't have any texture. Yeah.
And a question. My first one, the comment. Over the last couple of years, we've been bumping into people who are vacationing in Vermont for beer tours.
Yep.
And have their little books and little cards, and they're all giddy, and they're actually getting out of Burlington now and visiting us out in the countryside. In your wildest dreams back in the mid-'80s, did you ever think it would go that far?
No. No, I mean, it's just, it's just amazing. I mean, when you consider that, you know, beer tourism is going to be around in Vermont longer than skiing, if you believe in climate change. I mean, that's a somber observation, but no, I never would have believed that you'd have people driving. I mean, I mean, and also it's hard for me to imagine doing that, because after one or two good beers, what taste buds do you have left? And now, granted, you got to drive between towns, and you're going to have some crackers or something, but still, also, I mean, your mind is kind of shot too. But it's fine if it works for other people, and they have drivers who have good driving records, and they're not drinking. More power to them. Pardon? They do one each day. Yeah.
So the other question I had, because things have sort of exploded, when we were growing beer back in the late 80s, friends and family, we did it because it was the only beer that was sort of worth tasting, because the rest of it was considered junk after tasting homebrew. But now that there's so much available for good quality beer right across the spectrum, do you think there's less homebrewing being done now than 20 years ago?
That's a great question. I've thought about that off and on, and but I've never put my mind into looking to how to follow that up. I'm a life's member of the American Homebrewers Association, which means I get their bi-monthly booklet, magazines, and it's all slick, and it's full of very sophisticated homebrewing recipes and ingredients and stuff. And if you judge by that, you could say, well, yeah, there's been no stopping that urge. But on the other hand, I don't know. I would guess there's been less. I think that as with any hobbies, there's a bell curve, and it really grew to the point where you did have a number of those people saying, all right, I'm doing sophisticated homebrewing, I can do this, or I'll go find somebody with money. And see, that's another thing that's happened, is that besides the thread of brewers, of home brewers, who have gone into the brewing business, you've got Wall Street, or Wall Street denizens who say, well, this is a growth industry, or at least or you've got doctors and lawyers with too much money, and they think, well, I'm tired of, doing surgeries, doing the same surgeries. Why don't I go and find somebody, a brewer, and hire them, put the money in, and spend $300,000 or $400,000 for a couple of years, 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then treat it as a hobby, because they got plenty of money, they can lose it. So I think that's another cohort of sources of startups for brewers that, wouldn't you rather call yourself a brewer than a proctologist? I think it would be, that'd be pretty cool. And so if it doesn't work out, well, go and do something else. But in answer to your question, I don't know, and I might try to get a hold of the Homebrewers Association and ask them for an estimate. Anything else? Oh. Well, thanks for coming. Yeah. I got copies of this book. If anyone wants to buy one, be happy to. They're $10, and or actually the signature is $10. The book is free. Yeah.